My name is Cassandra Albright. I was 44 years old, a registered nurse, a mother, a wife, and by all accounts, just an ordinary woman. My days were built on 12-hour shifts, aching feet, antiseptic smells that clung to my hair and clothes, and falling asleep too many nights on the couch with the television still humming. I loved my husband, David, and I loved our two children, Leo and Maya, but my faith had become thin, a shadow of what it once was. I prayed every night, but they were rushed prayers, muttered half asleep, just a list of requests whispered into the dark. Deep down, I knew I had let my heart grow numb. I never imagined that June 2nd, 2025, would become the day that stripped me bare and pushed me into eternity. That evening began like any other. Dinner was warm on the table, the children bickering over who got the last piece of bread. I laughed. I sighed. I told them both to behave. But then a cough slipped out of me. By itself, it seemed harmless. By dessert, it was like I was breathing through wet cotton. By the time the sun had set, I could feel my lungs tightening, as if invisible hands were squeezing them shut. I had seen this before. I had treated patients in our hospital with the Stratus COVID variant, a merciless strain that shut down the body like a switch. I had prayed for them, tended to them, and I had whispered reassurances. But I never thought I would become one of them. David's voice shook as he dialed 911. I remember looking at my daughter standing in the doorway, her face pale with terror. My son hovered behind her, his hand gripping the frame so tightly his knuckles turned white. Those were the last images I saw with my earthly eyes. Not the ambulance, not the paramedics. Just the fear in my children's faces. That memory pierced my heart more sharply than the burning in my lungs. Then it happened. A release. It wasn't sound, but it felt like a string snapping inside of me. A pop that flung me free. In an instant, the pain evaporated. No fire in my chest. No pounding in my skull. I was floating, light as air, calm, detached. I looked down and I saw my body sprawled on the floor. David knelt over me, pounding on my chest with desperate fists, his face twisted with grief. I saw his lips forming words. "Don't you leave me, Cassie." The strangest thing was that I felt no panic, no fear, no horror. It was as if I were watching a scene in a film, familiar yet no longer mine. Paramedics stormed into the house, carrying machines and wires, voices sharp with urgency. They pressed paddles to my chest, my body jolting violently, but I felt none of it. I drifted higher, my senses muffled, the shouts and beeps fading like a radio dial turned slowly to silence. And then silence swallowed everything. Darkness wrapped around me, but it wasn't cruel. It wasn't the empty void of nightmares. It was soft, velvety, whole. No sense of time, no weight of a body, no breath to count. I didn't feel like Cassandra anymore. I didn't feel like anyone. I simply was. It could have been a second, or it could have been 1,000 years. There was no measure, only stillness. That was the moment I realized death was not an ending. It was a threshold. The absence of everything I once called life, aches, chores, schedules, made space for something infinitely larger. In that tender quiet, I became aware of something I had never truly known: peace, pure, undiluted, all-encompassing peace. My body was gone, yet I had never felt more alive. The main emotion in that moment was release. All the burdens of the world, bills, deadlines, regrets, slid off me like sand slipping through an open palm. My soul floated in silence, and for the first time since childhood, I felt free. The silence did not last. Out of that velvety darkness, something began to stir. It wasn't sight, at least not the way I had known sight on earth. It was sound, yet more than sound. Imagine the most perfect note of music ever played, so pure, so radiant, that it carries inside itself every memory of joy you have ever known. The warmth of sunlight after a cold morning, the grip of your baby's fingers around yours, the laughter of someone you love deeply woven into one resonant tone. That note was not around me. It was in me. It was me. Every fiber of my being vibrated in harmony with it. I realized then that I had lived my whole life slightly out of tune, always carrying dissonance I could not quite name. But here, in this sound, I was finally aligned. The darkness dissolved, not into light, but into presence. The air thickened, not with weight but with clarity, as though everything was becoming more real than real. And then I experienced him. Jesus. I cannot reduce him to the images you see in paintings, robes, halos, golden crowns. No. He was not light, but music made form. He stood before me as the very essence of that perfect note, yet shaped like a man. I wanted to fall, but there was no need to fall. His presence was not crushing, it was uplifting, restoring. His eyes were not just eyes, they were doorways, infinite wells of memory and meaning. When his gaze touched me, I did not feel as though he was uncovering my secrets. Instead, he was reminding me of my true self, the self I had forgotten, the self that had always been his. He spoke, but not with sound. His voice bloomed inside my soul, more familiar than my own name. And then he said my name, Cassandra. One single word, but it carried the memory of my creation inside it. When he spoke it, I heard his hope for me, his delight in me, his endless love that had never wavered. I broke then. Tears poured from me, not of grief, not of shame, but of a relief too deep for language. I realized every burden I had carried, all the regrets, the voices that whispered I wasn't enough, the hidden guilt melted in his presence. They had never been real in the first place. They were just noise I had picked up along the way. Standing before him, I was whole. I was not begging for forgiveness. I was not groveling. I was simply home. For the first time in my existence, I was fully alive, fully known, and fully loved. I cannot describe the peace except to say this. Imagine you have been holding your breath your entire life without realizing it, and suddenly you breathe. That first breath is what his presence felt like. The main emotion flooding through me was belonging. Not the kind of belonging you get from family or community, though those are shadows of it. This was absolute belonging, the certainty that I had always been his, that I had never been abandoned, that I was never alone, not even for a heartbeat. I reached toward him, though there was no need to reach. His smile wrapped around me, and in that smile, I felt the universe itself rejoicing. My tiredness, the exhaustion that had haunted me for years, fell away like an old coat. I could have stayed there forever, drinking in that presence. But he had more to show me. Without moving, he shifted the space around us. One moment I was standing in the music of his love. The next I was gazing at the earth itself from above, a fragile sphere wrapped in something dreadful. The earth turned slowly beneath us, suspended in space like a blue jewel. But it wasn't glowing the way I remembered it from pictures in textbooks or from the window seat of an airplane. Instead, it was smothered. A thick gray shroud clung to the planet, buzzing like static on a broken television. It writhed and spat sparks, twisting around continents, oceans, and cities until the whole world seemed buried under a suffocating blanket. At first, I thought it was smoke. Then I realized it wasn't anything material. It was energy, dark and chaotic, and it pressed heavy against my spirit even as I watched from above. It wasn't silent either. Underneath the hum of that static, I could feel anger, envy, despair, and hatred. It was like the earth itself was groaning under the weight of it. I turned to Jesus with horror in my heart. He looked at me, his eyes deep with sorrow, and he said, "This is the noise." His voice, as always, wasn't sound but knowing. It is the great distraction. It is meant to make you feel alone. It is meant to make you forget the song. As he spoke, the blanket of static shifted, and I could see into it. I saw news broadcasts, voices shouting in anger, screens filled with fear. I saw politicians twisting words until truth and lies were indistinguishable. I saw endless arguments spilling out across glowing phones, fingers typing poison into comment boxes. I saw homes filled with silence where families sat together yet ignored one another, each staring at their private device, lost in the noise. The more I looked, the heavier it felt. The static pulsed with fear, fear of neighbors, fear of strangers, fear of not having enough, fear of tomorrow. Every kind of fear had its place in that buzzing fog, and together it formed a wall between heaven and earth, drowning out the gentle melody of love. I could feel my heart breaking, the weight of despair pressing down. It seemed unstoppable, like an infection that had already spread too far. And then Jesus' words came again, calm but unshakable. The enemy feeds on fear, not only violence. Fear is enough. It is the loudest weapon he has. I remembered every patient I had treated in the hospital, the ones who looked at me with eyes wide and terrified, asking if they would live. Fear had gripped them before sickness even reached its peak. I remembered my own shallow prayers, whispered not out of love but out of fear. Fear of failure, fear of loss, fear of being forgotten. I understood now it wasn't just emotion, it was strategy, a spiritual invasion. The main emotion that filled me in that moment was sorrow, but beneath the sorrow came a rising urgency, a knowledge that humanity was being deceived. Not by something physical or visible, but by a noise carefully crafted to keep us blind to the truth. And in that space above the earth, I realized something else. A tidbit that struck me with frightening clarity. The enemy does not need to silence God's people with chains or prisons. He only needs to keep them distracted, angry, afraid. If their eyes stay glued to the noise, they will never notice the music beneath it. I turned back toward Jesus, my heart desperate for hope, because the vision of the world wrapped in that gray static seemed unbearable. And just when I thought despair might overwhelm me, he lifted his hand slightly, and the scene shifted again. The gray static hissed and writhed, but then I saw it, a tiny prick of gold piercing through. It was so small I almost missed it. But Jesus urged me with his presence. Look closer. The spark expanded into a thread of light. I followed it downward and saw a busy city street. A man in a business suit stopped walking, knelt, and handed his own lunch to a homeless woman huddled against a wall. The moment his hand touched hers, light flared from his chest. It wasn't grand, it wasn't dramatic, but it was real. The static around him recoiled, retreating from the brightness of his act. Then I saw another. A teenage girl sat in her bedroom, typing on her phone. She wrote to a classmate who had been bullied, "You are loved. Don't listen to them." The words shimmered as if carved in light, and from her device a golden strand arched outward, cutting through the noise. One after another, small lights flickered across the globe. A mother in India praying for a child she had never met in America. A son sitting silently with his elderly father, holding his hand without saying a word. A woman choosing to forgive the one who had broken her heart the most, releasing anger she had carried for years. Each act was quiet, almost invisible, yet every one of them pierced the suffocating gray. These sparks weren't isolated, they began to connect. Golden threads stretched out across continents, weaving a hidden network beneath the noise. It was breathtaking, a secret, silent symphony of love unfolding right beneath the chaos. Jesus' voice came again, steady and filled with hope. Do you see? The noise is loud, but the light is real. One act of love outweighs 1,000 voices of hate. The frequency of love heals what fear has broken. I could feel the truth reverberating inside me. My whole life, I had believed I needed to do something big for God to matter. I thought serving Him meant dramatic sacrifices, great missions, life-changing accomplishments. But here, He was showing me that eternity is not written in grand gestures, it is written in the smallest notes of kindness and mercy. The main emotion swelling in me was awe, a holy reverence for the hidden beauty I had overlooked. The world might scream with fear, but under the noise, love was building something eternal. And the tidbit I carried from this moment was this: God hides His greatest works in small places. What the world ignores in unseen prayer, a word of encouragement, a choice to forgive is thunder in heaven. The static has no defense against it. I stood there watching, as the golden web grew stronger, each act of love resonating with the next, the way notes form harmony when they meet. I realized that this was the true song of humanity, the original melody God had written into creation. But then the vision shifted once again. Jesus' expression grew solemn, and I felt the weight of what He was about to reveal next. For the static was not finished, and the noise was not done growing. What I had seen was only the beginning of the battle. The golden threads shimmered, connecting hearts across oceans and mountains, but as I gazed longer, I saw the gray blanket writhe and thicken. The static pulsed, feeding on something deeper. Its volume rose until it seemed the entire planet trembled beneath the noise. The beautiful light I had just witnessed began to look fragile against the rising storm. Jesus turned His face toward me, and I knew without words that He was about to show me the future. My soul braced, but nothing could have prepared me for what came next. I saw sickness spreading like a shadow over cities. Not only the Stratus variant that had taken my own life, but other plagues and waves of affliction, each one heavier than the last. Hospitals overflowing, fear magnified by screens, leaders arguing instead of comforting. The noise fed on every new outbreak, growing louder, choking hope from the air. Then I saw unrest sweeping across nations, people in the streets, shouting at one another, fists raised, divisions splitting families, churches, even entire countries. Anger was currency, traded freely, until neighbors became enemies and trust evaporated. The static hissed with delight, thickening its grip. And finally I saw a deep, heavy confusion. It fell like a fog over humanity, not a fog of weather, but of spirit. People staggered as though blind, unable to tell truth from lies, unable to recognize light even when it shone directly in front of them. This confusion was worse than sickness or conflict. It was a paralysis of the soul. The weight of despair crashed into me. It felt unbearable, as though the whole world might drown beneath that static. My heart cried out silently, "Lord, how can anyone survive this? How can the light possibly endure?" But even as I thought it, he turned his gaze back to me. His eyes were fire and tenderness all at once. "The noise will grow louder," he said within my spirit, "but the light will not be overcome. The more the world shakes, the clearer my song will become in those who choose love over fear." I looked again, and this time I saw the lights differently. Instead of fading, they grew sharper, brighter, more defined. The people who carried the light began to find one another. They formed circles, communities, networks of hope that no static could fully silence. What began as threads became webs, and what became webs became unbreakable chains of golden fire linking hearts across the earth. And I understood. The world would not be saved by revolutions or armies or politics. It would be saved by the quiet army of those who refused to bow to fear. By the mothers forgiving, the fathers praying, the children encouraging, the strangers offering kindness. It would be a war without weapons, fought in kitchens and sidewalks and hospitals, a war waged by patience, mercy, and relentless love. The main emotion in this vision was a strange paradox, sorrow for the pain that was coming, but also a fierce hope for the resilience of love. Because love was not fragile, it was eternal. It cut through the noise like a blade, and it never failed. And the tidbit that burned into me was this: power in the world's eyes is loud, but in God's kingdom, true power is often silent. The whisper of love has more authority in heaven than the shouts of nations. I fell to my knees not in worship, but in trembling. What I had seen was terrifying, but also beautiful. The world was heading toward great shaking, yet within that shaking, the true children of light would rise. And as the vision faded, Jesus' gaze softened again. He knew my heart, my longing, my dread. I wanted to stay in the safety of his presence, but he was already preparing me for the moment I would resist with all my soul, the moment he told me I must return. The vision of the static faded, and once again I stood in the music of his presence. My whole being trembled with awe, with fear, and with longing. More than anything, I wanted to remain there. To never again breathe the heavy air of earth, to never again feel the ache of a weary body, to never again face the noise. I turned toward him, my soul aching like a child begging her father. "Please," I cried, though no sound passed my lips, "please let me stay. I am ready. I don't want to go back." The sorrow of that plea ran through me like fire. It wasn't rebellion, it was desperation. Because compared to his presence, everything else felt unbearably small, unbearably broken. I thought of the hospital corridors, the news anchors shouting about fear, the weight of bills, the arguments, the endless exhaustion. None of it could compare to the peace I was breathing now. Jesus looked at me, and his eyes pierced deeper than the despair. They carried a love so ancient, so eternal, that it steadied me even in my plea. "My dear child," he said within my soul, "your part of the song is not finished." I wanted to argue, but before I could, he spoke names. Leo still needs to learn how to hear his note. Maya came to shine as a beacon, but she needs her mother to show her how. David's heart is tied to yours, and he cannot walk without you. Hearing their names and his voice tore me open. It was not condemnation. It was commissioning. It was purpose. I saw my son, struggling to grow into a man. I saw my daughter, her little light still tender, waiting for guidance. I saw my husband, his heart steady yet fragile, without mine beside him. And suddenly I understood. My mission was not about changing the whole world. It was about loving the ones he had entrusted to me. Still I faltered. But I don't know how, I thought, despair creeping back in. The noise is too loud. How can I fight it? His reply was a whisper that shook eternity. You don't have to fight it. You just have to sing your note. I felt those words sink into me like living fire. He went on. Love your family. Be kind to the stranger at the grocery store. Forgive the one who cuts you off in traffic. Pray for your enemies not for their destruction, but for their healing. Each time you choose love over fear, you strengthen the network of light. You make my song louder on earth. The main emotion that filled me was purpose. For years, I had lived under the lie that my life was too ordinary to matter. I believed I was just another nurse, another wife, another mother. But here was Jesus himself telling me that eternity was shaped not by grand achievements, but by the smallest acts of love done faithfully. And the tidbit I carried from that moment was this: the enemy cannot counterfeit love. He can mimic miracles, stir fear, counterfeit signs, but he cannot create selfless love. Every time you love, you release something he has no defense against. I realized then that my mission was simple but sacred, not to preach to millions, not to build empires, but to live each moment as a note in God's eternal song. To tune myself to his melody and teach my children to do the same. Jesus extended his hand not to touch me, but as if offering me the strength to choose. His eyes never left mine. They spoke of pain, because he knew how much it would hurt me to leave. They spoke of joy, because he knew the fruit that would come from my obedience. The shock was a cruelty the world could not have softened for me. One moment I was wrapped in the sweetest presence I had ever known, soft light like a memory, a gentle hum inside my bones, the warm breath of God's voice, and the next, I was being ripped back through something like a storm. It felt violent, like being pulled through a narrow tunnel at a speed that bruised the inside of my chest. A cold, sharp pain slammed into me, and I gasped into a world that smelled of bleach and metal under a terrible fluorescent glare that made my skin ache. You can still feel it when I close my eyes, the sting of hospital light, the distant soft beeping of machines, the sterile tang on my tongue. They shoved a tube down my throat, and for a minute, everything blurred into noise. Muffled shouts, the rasp of someone's voice saying my name, the pressure in my ribs like a weight I could not lift. My hands were heavy, my fingers open to find David's grip, raw and trembling. He held my other hand so tight I could feel the warmth of him through my fog. He was shouting, but it sounded far away, as if the world around me had been turned up too loud, and all I could do was squeeze back with the last of what I had. You feel that squeeze in your chest now as I remember it, a small, solid thing in the middle of a storm. A doctor leaned over me, his face close and clinical and stunned. "Cassandra, can you hear me?" he asked, voice like a lifeline. I tried to answer, and the sound was a croak, thin and fragile. Someone told me later that they had declared me dead. My heart had stopped. My breathing had ceased. They'd shocked me 7 times. They had been about to write the time of death when my heart inexplicably began to beat again. 22 minutes, they called it. 22 minutes that felt like an eternity and also a door. 22 minutes in which I had held the music of heaven in my bones and learned that my life was not mine to squander. The main emotion that anchored me as I woke was resolve. Not the brittle kind that pretends to be brave. This was deep, quiet steel, wrapped in tenderness. I had tasted home, and I knew I could not unknow it. I lay there, hot and broken and alive, and the memory of his eyes, those doorway eyes that held my name, pressed like a promise against the inside of me. I thought of Leo fumbling with his keys in the driveway, Maya's small hands reaching for mine, David whispering prayers in the dark at night. I had been sent back not to perform miracles on a stage, but to stitch small, holy seams in the lives around me. That knowledge hardened into a gentle determination. I would obey. I would sing my note. The doctors were baffled. Spontaneous recovery, they called it, with a catalog of textbooks in their eyes and a lack of wonder on their tongues. You should have severe brain damage, one told David later. but she doesn't. The CT scans are clean. Her lungs should be scarred. They are almost normal. They used medical language like a shield. Miraculous. Anomaly. Unexplained. Their words were clinical and precise. But when they looked at me, there was something like awe that slipped through the professional mask. They could chart the oxygen levels and count the shocks, but they couldn't map the harmonies I had been given. You know what I learned? Medicine can explain bodies but not missions. 2 weeks later, the scans were almost clear. The doctor used charts and graphs and words like unexpected. But at night when the hallway lights dimmed and the nurses whispered, I would close my eyes and hear that note again, the one that had reset me. The soft hum returned under the beeping machines like a secret. Sometimes David would brush my hair back and say, half laughing, half weeping, "You scared us all to death." I would smile at him with a tired, fierce gratitude that felt like prayer. He carried the marks of those minutes, too, the gray under his eyes, the tremor in his voice that came when he spoke my name. We were both changed. I came home with a body that had been through a war it did not remember. My lungs, the same organs that had betrayed me, worked with a new grace for a while. I woke sharper, more awake than I had been in years. The ordinary things tasted different. Coffee in the morning was like communion. The brush of a child's hair at bedtime felt sacramental. The smell of antiseptic that used to chase me like a ghost now only reminded me of where I had been and what I had been given. Sometimes in the quiet hum of the house, when the world was turned down low and the noise had retreated to a dull undercurrent, I would press my fingers to my chest and remember the feel of heaven's hand, soft, unassuming, and promise myself to live as if his presence was the only map I needed. The tidbit I carried back was simple and practical. You do not have to do great, headline-stealing things to shift the world. What you do at the kitchen table, in the waiting room, bedside, and parking lot, those choices build the web of light. Each small act of love, each soft word, each forgiveness spoken into the dark is an arrow that pierces the gray. I had been given a mandate that was both ordinary and cosmic: to love, to forgive, to study my family, to teach my children how to hear their notes. So I began to live deliberately. I turned off the news more often. I picked up the phone and called instead of texting. I knelt beside Maya's bed and prayed again with her, slow and clumsy, and she learned how to breathe into God's name. I forgave people in ways that felt ridiculous and powerful, small absolutions that loosened chains I hadn't even known I carried. I went back to the hospital not as the exhausted nurse who had been numb at the end of her shift, but as someone who carried a quiet rumor of hope. When a patient whispered fear, I met it with presence. When a family argued over who would take care of Mom, I sat and listened until the room softened. You continue to hear me, don't you? You know that these acts are not showy. They are the deep, patient work of a world being rewired by mercy. I do not have all the answers. I do not know the day the noise will recede, nor do I know all the ways the static will thicken. But I know the truth I held in heaven. One perfect note is stronger than 1,000 lies. I know now that love is the frequency that heals. The transformation was not instant or grand in the way people expect from stories. It was a slow, steady rewiring, a life retrained, a family retaught, a heart tuned. I fell more in love with ordinary days. I learned to listen for the music beneath the static, and when I found it, I sang. Slow down with me for a moment. Feel the soft air on your skin, the gentle thrum of your own heartbeat, the faint rustle of life around you. I am not here to frighten you. I am here to remind you that heaven is real, and that the call you have been given may look like small, ordinary love. The world is loud, the news, the screens, the voices, but beneath it, there is a melody waiting for you to join. You don't need a podium or a title. You need a willing heart, a patient hand, a forgiving word. If these words resonate with you, leave an amen in the comments, subscribe to the channel, and share it with at least 3 friends or family members right now. Now is your time to make a difference. Spreading this message is not only an act of love, but also a mission that Jesus himself has entrusted to you.